Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight I bring you another terrifying story. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Let's begin. I can still hear them screaming. Even now, 6 months later, when I close my eyes, I'm back in that tunnel. The headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio crackling with voices that shouldn't exist, and the cold. God, the cold that seemed to seep right into my bones. My name is Ethan Blackwood, and I've been driving trucks for 17 years. 17 years of crossing this country from coast to coast, hauling everything from electronics to furniture, seeing every mile of interstate America has to offer. I've driven through blizzards in Wyoming, sandstorms in Arizona, and fog so thick in Oregon I couldn't see my own hood ornament. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. Most people don't understand what it's like out here. The solitude, the responsibility, the way the highway becomes your whole world when you're pushing through the night to make a delivery deadline. My rig is a 2019 Peterbilt 579 Midnight Blue with chrome stacks, and she's been my home away from home for the past 4 years. I named her Big Blue. I know it's not creative, but when you're spending 14 hours a day in the cab, you start talking to your truck like she's family. I run primarily Midwest routes for Henderson Logistics out of Kansas City. Good company, fair pay, and they don't push drivers beyond DOT regulations like some of the bigger outfits. My regular route takes me from Kansas City to St. Louis, then up through Illinois and over to Indianapolis before heading back. It's a 3-day cycle that I've run probably 200 times. I know every truck stop, every way station, every mile marker between those cities. Or at least I thought I did. The thing about being a long-haul driver is that you develop routines. You have your preferred fuel stops, your favorite diners, the rest areas where you know it's safe to grab some sleep. You learn which dispatchers to trust and which shipping clerks will actually have your paperwork ready when you arrive. After 17 years, it becomes second nature. You could drive some of these routes blindfolded. CB radio is still king out here despite what people think. Handle names, smoky reports, and the constant chatter of drivers sharing information about road conditions, speed traps, and good places to eat. My handle is Blackwood Express, not particularly clever, but it gets the job done. The CB keeps you connected when you're out here alone, especially during those long midnight hauls when it feels like you're the only person awake in the world. I've got a wife, Sarah, and 2 kids back in Kansas City. Tommy just turned 12 and little Emma is 8. Sarah works as a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital. And she's gotten used to me being gone 3 or 4 days at a time, but she still worries. Every morning when I'm on the road, she texts me, "Drive safe. Come home to us." Every night, no matter how tired I am, I call to say goodnight to the kids. It's the routine that keeps me grounded, keeps me remembering what I'm working for. October 23rd, 2023. I remember the date exactly because it was the Monday after Emma's school fall festival. She'd won 2nd place in the pumpkin decorating contest, and I promised her I'd be back by the weekend to take her and Tommy to the haunted house at Worlds of Fun. Funny how life throws those little ironies at you. I'd picked up a load of office furniture in Kansas City that morning, bound for a corporate complex in St. Louis. Should have been routine. I'd made that exact run dozens of times before. The weather forecast called for light rain, nothing unusual for late October in Missouri. I pulled out of the Henderson yard at 6 a.m. sharp, planning to make St. Louis by early afternoon, get unloaded, and deadhead back to Kansas City for a good night's sleep in my own bed. The first sign something was different came around 11 p.m. I was making good time on I-70 about 40 miles east of Columbia when dispatch called with a change of plans. The receiving dock in St. Louis had called in with some kind of equipment failure, couldn't take delivery until Wednesday morning. Dispatch asked if I could park the load overnight at the Pilot in Warrenton and continue first thing in the morning. Now, any experienced driver will tell you that schedule changes are part of the business. Shippers change their minds, receivers have problems, weather delays things. It's just the reality of trucking. But something about this change felt off. When I asked the dispatcher, Janet, for details about the equipment failure, she was vague, said she'd just gotten the call and didn't have specifics. Janet's been with Henderson for 8 years and she's usually on top of every detail. By the time I reached the Warrenton area, the light rain had turned into a proper downpour. Not dangerous, but enough to cut visibility and make the road slick. I was looking for the pilot truck stop when my GPS started acting up. The screen kept flickering and the satellite connection seemed spotty. Then it directed me to take an exit I'd never noticed before. Exit 188, marked for Millwood Road. Here's the thing that should have been my first real warning. I've driven I-70 through that area countless times and I could have sworn there was no exit 188. I know that stretch of highway like the back of my hand. But there it was, plain as day with proper signage and everything. The GPS was insisting this was a shortcut to the pilot, so I figured maybe they'd built a new interchange since my last run through the area. The off-ramp curved to the right, leading to a narrow 2-lane road that disappeared into the darkness ahead. No streetlights, no buildings visible, just the white lines of the road stretching into the rain and fog. My CB radio started picking up some static, but I could still hear the occasional trucker checking in with locations and traffic reports. Everything seemed normal, just a different route to a familiar destination. Millwood Road wound through what looked like typical Missouri countryside, rolling hills covered with trees, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a porch light glowing in the distance. But as I drove deeper into this unfamiliar territory, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The road surface was too perfect, like it had just been paved, but there were no construction signs or equipment anywhere. The yellow center line was bright and fresh, almost glowing in my headlights. After about 10 minutes of driving through this perfect countryside, I saw it ahead in the distance, a tunnel cut right through a hill. Now there are plenty of tunnels in Missouri, especially in the more mountainous southern regions. But I'd never heard of any tunnels on the back roads around Warrenton. This thing looked substantial too, not just a highway underpass, but a proper tunnel maybe a quarter-mile long. As I approached the tunnel entrance, I noticed there was no signage indicating height clearance or weight restrictions. Information that's crucial for commercial vehicles. Every tunnel I'd ever driven through had clear markings for truck traffic, but this one just had a simple green sign that read Millwood Tunnel, 1.2 miles. Even that seemed wrong. From the outside, the tunnel didn't look nearly that long. The moment I entered that tunnel, everything changed. First thing I noticed was the temperature drop. Must have been 15 degrees colder inside than outside. My breath started fogging up, which made no sense because I had the heater running. The second thing was the sound. Instead of the normal echo you'd expect in a tunnel, everything seemed muffled, like the walls were absorbing the sound of my engine. The tunnel was wider than I'd expected from the entrance, easily wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic, but there were no lane markings on the asphalt. The walls were smooth concrete or stone, lit by evenly spaced fluorescent fixtures that cast an odd, bluish light. Not warm highway lighting, but something cold and clinical like you'd find in a hospital basement. I'd been driving for about 2 minutes when I tried to call dispatch on the CB to let them know I'd found an alternate route to the pilot. But when I keyed the mic, all I got was static. Dead static, like there was no signal at all. I tried adjusting the antenna and switching channels, but every frequency was the same. Just empty white noise. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. Losing CB signal isn't unheard of in tunnels, but this felt different. The static had a quality to it, almost like voices just below the threshold of understanding. I kept thinking I could hear words, fragments of conversation, but every time I focused on it, it would slip away. I turned the volume up, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, and that's when I caught my first clear transmission. A voice came through the static, clear as day. "Eastbound truck in the blue Peterbilt, you need to turn around. Don't go any deeper." The voice sounded urgent, almost panicked. I grabbed my mic and responded, asking for the driver's location and handle, but got nothing back except that empty static. I tried several more times, but the voice didn't come back. Now, CB etiquette among truckers is pretty standard. If someone gives you a warning, especially about road conditions or hazards, you acknowledge it and usually ask for details. The fact that this driver didn't respond to my callback was unusual. But what really bothered me was how he described my truck. From inside the tunnel at night with the rain, how could another driver have identified my specific truck model and color? I checked my odometer and realized I'd been in the tunnel for over 5 minutes, covering maybe 3 miles, but according to the sign at the entrance, the tunnel was only 1.2 miles long. I should have been out the other side by now. I started paying closer attention to the mile markers inside the tunnel, but here's the strange part. There weren't any. No exit signs, no emergency phone locations, nothing to indicate how far I'd traveled or how far I had left to go. The fluorescent lights continued in their regular pattern along the walls, but I started noticing that some of them were flickering. Not the normal flicker of old bulbs, but a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. And as I drove deeper into the tunnel, more of the lights were doing it. The effect was hypnotic and deeply unsettling. That's when I saw the first truck. In my rearview mirror, I caught sight of headlights behind me. At first, I was relieved. Another driver who could confirm I wasn't losing my mind about this tunnel. But as the truck got closer, something about it seemed wrong. The headlights were the old sealed beam type, the kind they stopped using on commercial vehicles back in the 80s. And the truck itself, when I could make out its silhouette, looked like an old cab-over Freightliner, the boxy style from maybe 30 years ago. I tried reaching the driver on CB, cycling through the standard channels, 19, 17, 9, but still nothing except that strange static. The old truck stayed about 50 yards behind me, maintaining the same speed, never trying to pass or signal. In my side mirrors, I could see the driver's silhouette in the cab, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a dark shape behind the wheel. After another few minutes, and my odometer now showed I'd traveled over 6 miles in a 1.2-mile tunnel, I saw more headlights ahead. 3 trucks were coming toward me in what should have been the opposing lane, but remember, there were no lane markings in this tunnel. They were spread across the roadway like they were blocking it. As they got closer, I could see these were also older trucks. A Kenworth W900 from maybe the 70s, a Mack with the old bulldog hood ornament, and what looked like a Peterbilt 359 with the long nose and round headlights. Classic trucks, the kind you see at truck shows, but not the kind you'd expect to encounter making freight runs on a rainy Monday night in modern Missouri. The 3 trucks slowed as they approached me, and I had to reduce speed to avoid a collision. They came to a complete stop about 20 feet in front of my bumper, effectively blocking the tunnel. I set my air brakes and grabbed the CB mic, trying to reach the drivers, but still got nothing but static. Through my windshield, I could see the drivers in their cabs, but they were just dark silhouettes like shadow puppets behind their steering wheels. I sat there for what felt like 10 minutes, engine idling, waiting for some kind of communication or movement from the other trucks. The driver behind me had also stopped, maintaining that same 50-yard distance. The whole situation felt like a standoff, but I had no idea what we were supposed to be standing off about. Finally, I decided to get out and approach the lead truck on foot, standard procedure when you're dealing with a potential breakdown or road blockage. Driver-to-driver communication. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, immediately noticing how the cold air hit me like a physical force. The temperature inside the tunnel had to be near freezing now, and I could see my breath in thick clouds. As I walked toward the lead truck, the old Kenworth, I called out to the driver, identifying myself and asking if there was a problem ahead. My voice echoed strangely in the tunnel, seeming to bounce back from much further away than the walls should have allowed. When I got within about 10 feet of the Kenworth, I could see through the windshield into the cab. There was no one there. The driver's seat was empty. Not just unoccupied, but empty in a way that suggested no one had been there for a very long time. The seat was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there were spider webs spanning from the steering wheel to the door frame. But the engine was running, the headlights were on, and I could see the exhaust vapor rising from the chrome stacks. I checked the other 2 trucks and found the same thing, empty cabs but running engines and functioning lights. All 3 trucks were covered in a fine layer of dust and grime that suggested they'd been sitting abandoned for months or years. But they were clearly operational. The license plates were old-style Missouri tags dating back to the early 90s. That's when I heard the voices. Coming from my own truck, I could hear the CB radio crackling with conversation. Multiple voices overlapping, all talking at once. I ran back to Big Blue and grabbed the mic, hearing fragments of discussion about weather conditions, load deliveries, and route information. Normal trucker chatter except for one thing. Every location they mentioned was from the 1990s. Drivers were talking about fuel prices that were 30 years out of date, referring to truck stops and diners that had been closed for decades, mentioning highways that had been renumbered years ago. And they all seemed to be reporting from this same area, somewhere around Warrenton, Missouri, but describing it as it had been in a different era. I keyed the mic and tried to join the conversation, asking for current conditions and a radio check. The response was immediate and chilling. Every voice on the radio stopped talking at exactly the same moment, creating a silence so complete it felt like the inside of a tomb. Then one by one they began to speak directly to me. "Blackwood Express, you need to leave this place. Turn your truck around, Ethan, this isn't your road. The tunnel doesn't end, driver, it just keeps going deeper." They knew my handle. They knew my name. And they were warning me about something I was only beginning to understand. I asked them who they were, how they knew my name, and what was happening in this tunnel. The response came from a voice that sounded older, more authoritative than the others. "We're the drivers who didn't listen to the warnings, son. Been in this tunnel since 93, 95, 97, different years, same mistake. We thought we could push through, deliver our loads, get home to our families." The implications of what I was hearing started to sink in. These weren't just strange radio transmissions, these were the voices of drivers who had entered this tunnel decades ago and somehow never left. The empty trucks in front of me weren't abandoned. They were evidence of what happened to drivers who ignored the warnings and tried to complete their journey through this place. I climbed back into my cab and tried to put the truck in reverse, planning to back out the way I'd come. But when I looked in my mirrors, the tunnel behind me stretched back into darkness as far as I could see. The truck that had been following me was nowhere to be found, and the entrance I'd driven through seemed to have disappeared entirely. Big Blue's engine was running rough now, like she was struggling against something more than just the normal resistance of backing up a loaded trailer. The temperature gauge was climbing, which made no sense in the frigid air of the tunnel, and the fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, as if the truck was working much harder than normal just to maintain basic operations. The voices on the CB radio continued their warnings, becoming more urgent. "Don't try to back out, Ethan. The tunnel doesn't work that way. You have to find the exit, but it's not where you think it is. Look for the maintenance door, son. That's the only way out for the living." "A maintenance door?" I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab again, this time looking carefully at the tunnel walls as I walked. The smooth concrete surface looked unbroken, but after several minutes of searching, I found what they were talking about. A door painted the same color as the wall, almost invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. The door was marked with a simple sign, "Authorized personnel only." No company name, no warning about alarms or security systems, just that basic restriction. The handle was an old-fashioned lever type, and when I pushed down on it, the door opened easily, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. The staircase was steep and narrow, with metal grating for steps and a handrail that felt ice-cold even through my gloves. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the confined space, and there was a draft of even colder air coming from somewhere above. After climbing for what felt like several minutes, I reached another door. This door opened onto what looked like a service road or maintenance area above the tunnel. I was standing on a hillside covered with trees, and I could see the interstate in the distance, maybe half a mile away. The rain had stopped, and there were stars visible through breaks in the clouds. Normal October weather, normal Missouri countryside, nothing supernatural or threatening about any of it. But when I looked back toward where the tunnel entrance should have been, there was nothing. Just a hillside covered with trees, no road, no tunnel, no sign that any kind of highway construction had ever existed in this area. It was as if the tunnel had simply vanished the moment I stepped outside of it. I hiked through the woods toward the interstate, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The GPS was working normally now, showing my location as a wooded area about 3 miles east of Warrenton, roughly where I thought I should be based on my original route. When I reached I-70, I flagged down a state trooper who was making his regular patrol. Trooper Williams was professional and helpful, but clearly skeptical about my story. He'd never heard of a Millwood Road exit or a tunnel in this area. According to him, there was no exit 188 on I-70 between Columbia and St. Louis. When I showed him the maintenance road where I'd emerged from the woods, he said it looked like an old logging road that probably hadn't been used in decades. He gave me a ride back to where my truck should have been, according to my story. But of course there was nothing there. No tunnel, no road, no Big Blue with her load of office furniture. Just woods and farmland under the late-night sky. The trooper suggested I might have fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing, maybe pulled over at a rest area without remembering it clearly. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The cold, the voices, the empty trucks, the fear that had gripped me in that tunnel. None of that had the hazy quality of a dream. And I had evidence, even if no one would believe it. My phone showed the exact time and GPS coordinates of where I'd emerged from the woods. My clothes still smelled like diesel exhaust and that strange, cold air from the tunnel. Trooper Williams called dispatch and arranged for Henderson Logistics to send another driver to pick me up. While we waited, I asked him about missing truckers or abandoned vehicles in this area. He said there had been reports over the years of drivers who disappeared on this stretch of I-70, but most were eventually found to have had medical emergencies or personal problems that caused them to abandon their routes. Most? I asked. He hesitated before admitting that there were 3 cases in the past 30 years where experienced drivers had simply vanished without explanation. Their trucks were never found, and there was no evidence of accidents or foul play. Just 3 professional drivers who'd been making routine runs through Missouri and had disappeared as completely as if they'd never existed. The Henderson driver who picked me up was a guy named Rick Moreno, someone I'd worked with for years. He was more concerned about my well-being than skeptical about my story, but he also had no explanation for what had happened to Big Blue. The truck had GPS tracking, and according to the company's system, it had simply stopped transmitting around 11:30 p.m. in the area where I'd encountered the tunnel. Back at the Henderson yard the next morning, I sat down with the dispatcher, Janet, and the fleet manager to file a complete report about the missing truck and trailer. They'd already contacted their insurance company and the local authorities. The load was worth about $40,000 and Big Blue herself was valued at over $150,000. It was a significant loss for the company. But here's what really bothered me about the whole situation. When I described the call from dispatch that had changed my delivery schedule, Janet had no record of making that call. She'd left work at 5 p.m. that Monday, and there was no notation in the system about any equipment failure at the St. Louis delivery location. In fact, she'd checked with the receiver Tuesday morning, and they'd been expecting my delivery and were confused about why I hadn't shown up. So who had called me with the schedule change? The voice had sounded like Janet, and the caller had known details about my load and route that only someone with access to Henderson's dispatch system would have known. But according to company records, no such call had been made. I took 3 weeks off work after that incident, partly to deal with the insurance investigation and police reports, but mostly because I wasn't sure I was ready to get back behind the wheel of another truck. Sarah was understanding about the whole thing, even if she didn't entirely believe my version of events. She just wanted me safe and home with the family. During those 3 weeks, I did research. I spent hours online looking for information about the Millwood Tunnel, exit 188, or any similar reports from other drivers. What I found was disturbing. There were forum posts on trucking websites going back 20 years, describing encounters with phantom exits, disappearing tunnels, and CB radio voices from drivers who'd vanished decades earlier. Most of the reports were dismissed as urban legends or the hallucinations of tired drivers, but the details were too consistent to ignore. Always late at night, always involving a route change or GPS malfunction that led drivers to an unfamiliar road. Always a tunnel that was longer than it appeared, populated by the ghosts of truckers who'd made the same mistake years earlier. I found newspaper archives from the 1990s describing the disappearances that Trooper Williams had mentioned. 3 drivers, just like he'd said, all experienced professionals with clean safety records. Robert Chen in 1993, driving for a freight company out of Kansas City. Marcus Thompson in 1995, an independent owner-operator. And David Rodriguez in 1997. A Henderson logistics driver who'd been making the exact same route I was on when I encountered the tunnel. David Rodriguez, I remembered that name from the company's memorial wall in the break room. Drivers who died in the line of duty. I'd always assumed he'd been killed in an accident, but according to the newspaper archives, he'd simply vanished. Last radio contact at 11:45 p.m. on October 24, 1997, somewhere east of Columbia on I-70. His truck was never found, and the investigation was eventually closed as a missing person case. October 24, 1997. I'd encountered the tunnel on October 23, 2023. Different years, but almost exactly the same date. And among the forum posts I'd found online, other drivers reported similar encounters on dates clustered around late October. Like whatever was responsible for the tunnel became active during a specific time of year. After my 3-week break, I went back to work for Henderson, but I requested routes that kept me away from I-70 between Columbia and St. Louis. I told them it was because of psychological trauma from losing my truck, which wasn't entirely untrue. The company was accommodating, and I spent the next several months running loads through Illinois and Iowa instead of my usual Missouri routes. But avoidance could only last so long. Henderson needed experienced drivers for their Missouri routes, especially during the busy holiday shipping season. In early December, they asked if I'd be willing to take a load from Kansas City to Springfield, Missouri. It was a southern route that wouldn't take me anywhere near the area where I'd encountered the tunnel. I agreed to the Springfield run, and it went smoothly. Good weather, no problems with the load or delivery, and most importantly, no mysterious tunnels or phantom radio transmissions. It felt good to be back on familiar highways doing the job I'd been doing for 17 years. I started to think that maybe I was ready to resume normal operations. Over the winter months, I gradually worked my way back to running the full range of Henderson's routes, including some that took me through central Missouri. I was careful to stick to major highways during daylight hours, avoiding back roads and night driving whenever possible. Everything seemed normal, and I began to wonder if the whole tunnel incident had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown or hallucination. But then came March 15, 2024. I was running a load from Kansas City to Memphis, taking I-70 east to I-44 south through Springfield. It was a route I'd driven hundreds of times, entirely on major interstates, with no opportunity for GPS malfunctions or wrong turns onto phantom roads. I was feeling confident, almost cocky, about having put the October incident behind me. Around 11 p.m., just east of Columbia, my CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that made my blood run cold. Blackwood Express, this is Rodriguez. You're coming up on the exit, driver. Don't take it this time. Stay on the interstate. David Rodriguez, the Henderson driver who disappeared in 1997. He was warning me about the same exit that had led me to the tunnel 5 months earlier. I grabbed my mic and responded, asking for his location and confirming his identity, but got only static in return. However, the warning was enough to make me pay close attention to the road ahead. Sure enough, there it was, exit 188 Millwood Road, exactly where it had been in October. The same clean signage, the same well-maintained off-ramp disappearing into the darkness. But this time I stayed on I-70, maintaining speed and ignoring the GPS system as it tried to redirect me toward the phantom exit. As I passed the exit, I saw headlights in my mirrors. Another truck taking the Millwood Road ramp. A newer Freightliner Cascadia, the kind used by several major shipping companies. I tried reaching the driver on CB to warn them, but either they couldn't hear me or they chose not to respond. I watched in my mirrors as their taillights disappeared down the off-ramp, swallowed by the darkness. I called 911 and reported what I'd seen, giving the state police the license number of the truck that had taken exit 188. The dispatcher was polite but clearly skeptical, especially when I couldn't give her a precise location for the exit. According to official records, there was no exit 188 on that stretch of I-70. The next morning, I called Henderson's dispatch and asked them to check with other companies about any missing drivers from the previous night. Janet made some calls and got back to me with disturbing news. Consolidated Freight Lines had lost contact with one of their drivers, Paul Hendricks, somewhere between Columbia and St. Louis. His truck had GPS tracking, but the signal had cut out around 11:45 p.m. Paul Hendricks was driving a Freightliner Cascadia. I realized then that this wasn't just about me, and it wasn't just a historical phenomenon from decades past. The tunnel, or whatever force was responsible for it, was still active, still claiming drivers who were unfortunate enough to encounter it during those late-night hours in central Missouri. And somehow, I'd been spared, warned by the voices of earlier victims who were trying to prevent others from sharing their fate. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments. Which part chilled you the most? Don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to my channel for more terrifying stories.